On the night of November 27, 2009, Tiger Woods drove his Cadillac Escalade over a fire hydrant and into a tree outside his own home in Windermere, Florida, at roughly 2:25 in the morning. His wife, Ellen Nordegren, had broken the back windshield with a golf club to get him out. Within days, the story behind the crash would surface, and it would not be about a car accident. It would be about a decade of infidelity, hidden text messages, and a secret life that had been running underneath the most controlled public image in the history of professional sports. Tiger Woods, the most disciplined athlete anyone had ever studied, had been lying to nearly everyone around him for years, and almost nobody outside his inner circle had seen it coming. But somebody had described exactly this outcome, years earlier, without knowing it was a warning. That somebody was his own father. Earl Woods had died 3 years before the crash. He never saw the scandal, never saw the apology, never saw his son sit in front of cameras in 2010 and admit, in his own words, that he had been living a lie. But Earl had said things, on the record, years before any of it happened, that made sense of the collapse before the collapse existed. Nobody clipped those quotes as prophecy at the time. Why would they? Tiger was untouchable. He was the most famous athlete alive, and Earl Woods was just his proud, quotable father. That's the part of this story people still get wrong. To understand what Earl actually said, you have to go back to 1996, before any of it had happened. Tiger had just turned professional after 3 straight U.S. amateur titles, and Sports Illustrated sent a writer named Gary Smith to profile him as the magazine's Sportsman of the Year. Smith turned to Earl for a comment, and Earl gave him one of the most quoted lines in the history of sports journalism. He said Tiger would do more than any other man in history to change the course of humanity. He said Tiger was, in his words, the chosen one, someone who would have the power to impact nations, not people, nations. Smith, skeptical, asked if Earl meant Tiger would surpass figures like Gandhi or Mandela. Earl said yes, because Tiger would have a bigger platform than any of them. At the time, this was treated exactly the way you'd expect. Sports writers rolled their eyes. It sounded like a father who had lost all perspective, drunk on his son's talent, promising the world something no 20-year-old golfer could possibly deliver. Nobody was wrong to be skeptical. But buried in the same period, in interviews far less quoted than the chosen one line, Earl was saying something else entirely, something with none of the mysticism and all of the specificity. And that part turned out to matter more. Earl Woods was not a man who spoke in vague terms about golf. In 1998, in an interview later revisited by Golf Digest, he predicted a time when Tiger would be winning tournaments not by 2 or 3 shots, but by 10 and 15, margins that did not exist in modern professional golf. Writers at the time called it the ravings of an overheated parent. 2 years later, in 2000, Tiger won the U.S. Open at Pebble Beach by 15 strokes, the largest margin in major championship history, and followed it by winning the British Open by 8. Earl had not been guessing. He had been describing something he had built, in exacting detail, over more than a decade, and he knew precisely what it was capable of because he had built it himself. Here is what Earl Woods actually built. He was a former Green Beret with 2 tours in Vietnam, and he had trained as a prisoner-of-war interrogator, learning psychological pressure techniques designed to break a man's composure under extreme stress. He did not leave those techniques in the military. He used them on his son on the golf course, starting when Tiger was still a small child. He would deliberately try to unravel him mid-swing, needling him, distracting him, pushing him toward anger, all so that Tiger would learn to perform under conditions no opponent could ever replicate. He told interviewers directly that this was the point. He said he could say one word, and that word was the release valve that ended the exercise, and that if Tiger never had to use it, he would never meet another person as mentally tough as his son. This was not incidental parenting. It was a system, built with the same precision Ben Hogan once used to dissect his own golf swing into 77 separate parts, except Earl wasn't refining a swing. He was manufacturing a nervous system built to withstand pressure that would have broken almost anyone else. It worked. It is, by any honest measure, the single biggest reason Tiger Woods became the golfer he became. But building a competitor that unbreakable requires trade-offs, and Earl, more than anyone alive, understood exactly what those trade-offs were. He said so more than once, and it is the part of his commentary almost nobody remembers that I in the same stretch of interviews where Earl made his boldest predictions about Tiger's talent, he also made a quieter set of comments about Tiger's character that read completely differently now than they did then. He told one interviewer that he had taught Tiger from a very young age to be incapable of lying, that the one time Tiger lied as a boy, he became physically ill from the guilt of it. At the time, this was presented as a charming detail about a well-raised kid. After November of 2009, after Tiger's own admission that he had constructed an elaborate, years-long deception involving multiple affairs hidden from his wife, his sponsors, and the public, that same quote reads like a case study in exactly how far a person can drift from the character their parent believed they had built. Earl also said something else, describing what would happen once Tiger settled into marriage. He used the image of a caveman, a man built to hunt and provide and dominate, now finally sitting still at home with a wife he loved. Earl said that once Tiger reached that kind of peace, he would become, in his words, truly dangerous. He meant it as a compliment about competitive focus. It reads today as an accidental description of a man whose discipline was so total in one arena that it created dangerous blind spots in every other part of his life. And Earl said one more thing, almost offhand, about what the totality of Tiger's existence actually looked like from the inside. He said that to get any time to himself, Tiger essentially had to disappear, that he was always somewhere else, that he barely knew where he actually was from one day to the next. That is not a description of a champion. That is a description of a man being slowly detached from an ordinary life, a man being trained so completely for competition that there was nothing left over to build an identity around anything else. None of these comments were treated as warnings while Earl was alive, and there's a simple reason why. Between 1997 and Earl's death in May of 2006, Tiger Woods did not give anyone a single reason to doubt him. He won major championships at a pace nobody in the sport's history had matched. He was polite, controlled, and seemingly incapable of the kind of public unraveling that had ended other athletes' careers. Earl's most extreme prediction, the chosen one line, looked increasingly plausible rather than delusional. If you were going to bet on which of Earl's comments would define the next chapter of Tiger's life, in 2005 or early 2006, you would have bet on the humanity-changing prophecy, not the offhand line about a caveman becoming dangerous once he found peace. That's the moment in this story where the pattern looks wrong, where Earl's most grandiose claim looks like the accurate one and his smaller, darker observations look like nothing more than a proud father's odd phrasing. Earl Woods died on May 3, 2006, having watched his son win 11 of what would eventually be 15 major championships, and having no idea that the quieter half of what he'd said about him was the half that was about to become true. 3.5 years later, on that November night in Windermere, the other half of Earl's commentary stopped being an odd detail and became the explanation for everything. The affairs that surfaced numbered in the double digits by the time reporting had finished. Sponsors dropped him. His marriage ended. In March of 2010, in a televised statement, Tiger Woods said, in his own words, that he had been living a life of a lie. He said it plainly, without embellishment, the same directness his father had once described as an inability to lie at all. The man who Earl said got physically sick as a child from the guilt of a single lie had built a second, secret existence sustained by hundreds of them. The caveman who Earl said would become dangerous once he found peace at home had, instead, detonated the peace himself. And the son who Earl said was always somewhere else, who never quite knew where he actually was, had spent years being somewhere else in the most literal and damaging sense possible. Every quiet observation Earl Woods had made about his son's psychology, the ones nobody had bothered to treat as significant while he was alive, turned out to be more accurate than the mystical, headline-grabbing prophecy that made him famous. What happened afterward is its own kind of confirmation. Tiger Woods spent the 2010s rebuilding a life and a golf swing simultaneously, through swing changes, injuries, and 4 back surgeries, and in May of 2017 he was arrested for driving under the influence, found asleep behind the wheel from a combination of prescription medications. His world ranking fell past 1,000. And then, in April of 2019 he won the Masters at 43 years old, walking up the 18th fairway into a roar that lasted 30 unbroken seconds, his son Charlie running into his arms exactly where Earl once stood cheering for him decades earlier. It was the most complete redemption arc in modern sports, and it was built on the same foundation Earl had installed in him as a child: total, uncompromising discipline under pressure. That part of Earl's design never broke. It's the only part that never did. Earl Woods spent years being remembered for the one thing he said that sounded impossible: the promise that his son would change the course of humanity itself. That was the line that made the magazine cover. That was the line sports writers quoted at dinner parties, half in admiration and half in mockery, the line that turned an already famous rookie into something closer to a religious figure before he had even won a major championship on his own. It was bold, it was strange more completely than any player before or since, but because it told you nothing about who Tiger actually was underneath the talent. It told you what the world would see. It said nothing about what would happen when nobody was watching. The parts of Earl's commentary that actually predicted Tiger Woods' life weren't the grand ones. Prediction. It was a description of the boy Earl believed he had built. But descriptions like that carry an unintentional shadow. If you tell the world your son cannot lie, you are also had sustained a hidden double life for years. The shock wasn't just that he had lied. It was that he had lied so completely against a character his own father had sworn was structurally incapable of it. Earl didn't predict the affair. He predicted the size of the contradiction the affair would create. The same is true of the caveman line, and it might be the most quietly devastating thing Earl ever said about his son, precisely because he meant it as praise. He was describing a man built for conquest, uncomfortable with stillness, and he said that once that man finally found peace at home, he would become more dangerous than ever on the course. Earl meant dangerous to opponents. He meant a competitor so settled in his personal life that nothing could distract him from destroying the field. He did not mean dangerous to the peace itself, dangerous to the marriage, dangerous to the family he had just described as the source of his focus. But that is exactly what happened. The stillness didn't sharpen Tiger's danger toward Nicklaus's record. It exposed a fracture that had been there the whole time, one that the relentless motion of competition had been covering up for years. Take away the tournaments, take away the travel, take away the compulsive movement that had defined Tiger's entire life since childhood, and what was left underneath wasn't peace. It was a man who had never been taught what to do with stillness at all, because stillness had never once been part of the training. And then there's the smallest observation of the three, the one about Tiger always being somewhere else, never quite sure where he actually was. Earl said it almost as a joke, the way you describe an overscheduled executive who lives out of hotel rooms. But said about a person's entire adult life, said about someone who had been trained from early childhood to exist almost exclusively inside the pursuit of a single goal, it stops sounding like a joke. It starts sounding like a diagnosis. A man who does not know where he is has also, in some sense, lost track of who he is when the game isn't being played. That is the quiet cost of building an athlete as complete as Tiger Woods. You get a competitor who cannot be broken on a golf course. You risk producing a person who has nowhere left to stand once the golf course is gone. Nobody was listening for any of that. They were listening for the prophecy, the humanity-changing, nation-impacting, larger-than-Gandhi prediction, because that was the version of the story everyone wanted to be true. It was bigger. It was more exciting to repeat. It fit the moment, a 21-year-old dismantling every course he played, a golf swing that looked less like an athletic motion and more like inevitability. Grand predictions always get remembered, because they sound like destiny, and destiny is what audiences want from their heroes. Quiet observations get forgotten, because they sound like footnotes, like small talk, like a father filling airtime between the real headlines. But destiny is rarely what actually explains a person's life. The footnotes usually are. Earl Woods, without ever meaning to, had already told them exactly how the story would go. He just told them in the quietest sentence in the room, buried between the bold ones, dressed up as a compliment instead of a warning, and everyone was too busy watching the loudest one. That is usually how it works, not just with Tiger Woods, but with almost anyone whose collapse looks shocking in hindsight. The warning was rarely hidden. It was rarely secret. It was simply smaller than the myth standing next to it, and myths are what people choose to remember, right up until the quiet sentence turns out to be the only one that was ever telling the truth.